sir, you have no decency. You have no honor. You say inflammatory things because it thinks it will ingratiate you to those who are paying your salary. And you sit here before me and try to wrap yourself in the American flag. We are one nation under God, but you cut us up and divide us along racial lines.
Senator, respectfully, I do not think that they do.
You cannot use the word respectfully because you do not respect me.
Oh,
you
no,
look
actually,
upon
I do.
me as my color of my skin. You say holidays like Juneteenth are racial hustles. Don't come here and hustle me.
This is a cross-societal.
What do you mean when you say that you believe in the Great Replacement theory?
Senator, thank you for that question. This refers to the intentional demographic replacement of Europeans in Europe. It was invented by Renaud Camus, who was a French scholar.
You think there's an active effort to, quote unquote, replace Americans right now? This is the problem. You
Senator,
make the most incendiary comments that you admit that you regret about Jews, about Latinos, about blacks. And you sit here and say that you do not have a worldview, that somehow our country is weakened.
Does demographic change make America weaker? Senator Cory Booker repeatedly pressed Jeremy Karl for a direct answer, then confronted him over his comments about the Great Replacement theory and his past remarks about Jews, Latinos, and Black Americans. The exchange quickly became one of the hearing's most explosive moments.
Do you think that America would be weaker if it was, say, 40% Jewish?
Senator, absolutely not in and of itself. I think the problem...
Well, why did you qualify that?
No, Senator, if you let me finish, I believe that unity, as President Trump has said, rather than diversity, is a greater strength.
But why not simply say it doesn't matter what percentage of our population is Jewish?
Senator, it certainly doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Senator, if I could finish, as somebody of Jewish origin myself, and I do want to take this moment to say, because there have been some comments made, one of my weaknesses, and we've discussed some that you may think in general are weaknesses, is sometimes I take an idea too far. And I made some comments in interviews about minimizing the effect of the Holocaust that were absolutely wrong. And I'm not going to sit here and defend them here. I just want to be very, very clear on that point. Again, had I been in Germany in that time, even though I'm a sixth-generation American, but had I not, I would have been killed just like anybody else.
I've heard you say that you regret some of your comments about Jews.
Absolutely.
That controversy did not disappear after the hearing. Republican Senator John Curtis later announced that he would oppose Karl's nomination, specifically citing his insensitive remarks about Jewish people and his views concerning Israel. That Republican opposition became critical because Democrats were already expected to oppose him.
Do you regret any other comments about any other races?
Senator, you would have to reference a certain comment, but I'm certainly not a perfect person, and I'm sure that I've made...
Do you regret any of your comments about Latino Americans?
Senator, I'm sure that if you read me every single comment I'd made about a group, there would be some that, upon consideration...
So you stipulate for this body that you have in your past made comments about Jews and Latinos and perhaps blacks that you perhaps regret?
Senator, thank you for the question. As a Calvinist who believes that we're all infinitely sinful and only redeemed through grace...
See, sir, we're sending you into a very diverse world.
Yeah.
And you can't say unequivocally that America, it doesn't matter what our racial makeup is. You believe it matters what the racial makeup of America is.
Senator...
Do you believe it matters, yes or no, what the racial makeup of America is?
Senator, to echo President Trump, I believe
I don't want
unity
you to
rather
echo
than diversity...
President Trump. I want you to answer my question, yes or no. Does it matter what the racial makeup of America is?
Senator, I'll stand on my comment. Thank you.
What's your comment? Answer the question, yes or no.
Echoing President Trump, I believe unity rather than diversity is a strength.
So you have a problem if America grew to be more Latinos than white people?
Senator, the individual group is not important. This is a cross-societal...
What do you mean when you say that you believe in the Great Replacement theory?
Senator, thank you for that question. This refers to the intentional demographic replacement of Europeans in Europe. It was invented by Renaud Camus, who was a French scholar.
You think there's an active effort to, quote unquote, replace Americans right now?
Senator, I think the Democratic Party, through its immigration policies, has certainly shown signs of that.
And I don't understand that. So you are saying that if more Americans are Black or Latino Americans, that somehow weakens America because it puts whites in a minority?
Senator, I never said anything like that, nor do I actually believe that. I want to be very clear that regardless of country, if people generally share more in common, that's a strength.
Can I read you what you've said? Because it sounds like this. You said the Great Replacement is real, and they are going to try to make you pay for it. Who is they?
Senator, thank you for that question. I simply don't know from you reading that one isolated comment.
The Great Replacement issue raised in this exchange continued to follow Karl after the hearing. His past statements about demographic change, race, and immigration became part of the bipartisan opposition surrounding his nomination. The controversy ultimately contributed to Karl losing the Republican support he needed to advance through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
So this is the problem. You make the most incendiary comments that you admit that you regret about Jews, about Latinos, about Blacks, and you sit here and say that you do not have a worldview, that somehow our country is weakened based upon the populations of each. In fact, you say in your writings that it is a threat to the United States of America and create an us versus them. And the only interpretation I can have of us versus them is it's white people against others, which sounds deeply racist to me. That somehow you think our country's greatness depends upon its ethnic diversity as long as white people have more numbers than others. That does not sound like a nation that was founded with the belief that all people are created equal and equal before the eyes of God. It sounds like you have a racial hierarchy. There's no way for me to read this in any other way.
Senator,
because you have said our country, based upon religious diversity, based upon ethnic diversity, based upon racial diversity, you have indicated that somehow those make America weaker or stronger. That God forbid our nation grows in population, that then you suddenly say, I'm aggrieved, and they are trying to replace us. This is the United States of America. We are one nation under God, but you cut us up and divide us along racial lines.
Senator, respectfully, I do not think that they do.
You cannot use the word respectfully, because you do not respect me.
Oh,
you
no,
look
actually,
upon
I do.
me as my color of my skin. You say holidays like Juneteenth are racial hustles. Don't come here and hustle me.
Senator,
you have said statements that other nations are going to look upon you and read plainly. When you go to a country of a different religion or ethnicity, you have discriminated against Jews in your writing, you have discriminated against others, and then you claim yourself as a victim. Mr. Chairman, I've never seen such a blatantly racist individual who doesn't even deny that he's made these statements, but wants to tell us that he regrets them, and yet still believes that this body, who is committed to principles of equality, who is committed to ideals of our founders, that you're not in direct violation to the ideals and values and principles. And the last thing I want to say, I watched people beat others when they attacked the Capitol, viciously attack police officers. Brian Sicknick, a New Jersey resident, was beaten near death and would die days later. And you say those violent felons, you literally have said that they were treated worse than people during Jim Crow. When thousands of Americans were lynched, murdered, beaten, and killed, you equate Capitol Hill rioters with receiving worse treatment than Americans during Jim Crow, which even some of the worst people who participated in that violence and beatings have come forward decades later and said, I was wrong. It is shameful that when this body ran for its life, when they had gallows for the vice president put outside, when they tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power, that you would equate those people to the folks that were victimized and terrorized by white nationalist organizations like the KKK. Sir, you have no decency. You have no honor. You say inflammatory things because it thinks it will ingratiate you to those who are paying your salary. And you sit here before me and try to wrap yourself in the American flag? Well, I believe in this nation. I believe in the principles. I believe in those who fought and died for our country. You disgrace that legacy and the ideals that we all swear an oath to uphold, that does not believe in one nation for one people and another people. Dear God, I pray for us if we let somebody like you represent us to the diverse nations of the world as representing the values of our country.
Senator,
Mr.
I
Chairman,
absolutely
yield.
deplore Jim Crow, but I do not agree with the characterization that you have done of my views.
Jeremy Karl's nomination is no longer pending. The Trump administration formally withdrew his nomination on March 12, 2026, after Karl had appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and faced intense bipartisan opposition over his past comments about Jews, race, immigration, and the Great Replacement theory. The Senate's official withdrawal record confirms that his nomination for Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations was withdrawn by the president. That outcome is particularly significant because this was not simply a nomination that stalled in committee. Karl himself acknowledged that he did not have the Republican support necessary to overcome unanimous Democratic opposition, and Republican Senator John Curtis of Utah had publicly announced that he would oppose him. The position Karl was seeking was also consequential. As Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, he would have been responsible for helping shape U.S. policy toward the United Nations and other multilateral institutions. The State Department position therefore required him to represent the United States in an environment involving countries with radically different racial, ethnic, religious, and political backgrounds. The controversy surrounding his nomination became even more relevant because the Trump administration has simultaneously been pushing a major reassessment of America's relationship with international organizations. The Foreign Relations Committee has since continued holding hearings on reforming the UN and U.S. priorities toward international institutions, while the administration has pursued changes in U.S. participation and funding. The broader context makes the central question in Booker's confrontation especially important. Can someone credibly represent the United States abroad if his past public statements create doubts about whether he views Americans primarily as citizens or as members of competing racial and ethnic groups? That is what made Cory Booker's questioning so explosive. Booker was not simply asking Karl whether he personally believed one race was superior to another. Karl answered that he did not. The problem began when Booker asked a much more specific question. Would America be weaker if 40% of its population were Jewish? Karl eventually said that the percentage itself did not matter, but he initially qualified his answer by saying that unity, rather than diversity, was a greater strength. That distinction became the foundation of Booker's interrogation. Booker won an unequivocal statement that America's racial or religious composition does not determine its strength. Karl, meanwhile, tried to shift the discussion away from demographic percentages and toward his broader argument that social cohesion and shared national identity matter more than diversity as an abstract principle. There is a legitimate policy argument underneath Karl's position. A country can certainly debate whether social cohesion, common civic identity, assimilation, or shared values contribute to national stability. Saying that unity is important is not, by itself, a racist proposition. Karl was also entitled to argue that his views were being interpreted more broadly than he intended. When Booker pressed him about whether he believed America would be weaker if Latinos eventually became a larger share of the population, Karl repeatedly rejected the idea that any individual racial group was inherently more important than another. His defense was essentially that he was talking about societal cohesion rather than racial superiority. That distinction matters because criticizing diversity as a governing philosophy is not automatically equivalent to advocating a racial hierarchy. But Booker's counterargument was that Karl's broader record made those distinctions difficult to accept at face value. The senator was not evaluating one isolated sentence. He was connecting Karl's comments about demographics with previous statements about Jews, Latinos, Black Americans, Juneteenth, immigration, and the Great Replacement. Karl himself conceded during the hearing that he had sometimes taken ideas too far and explicitly acknowledged that previous comments minimizing the effect of the Holocaust were wrong. He did not attempt to defend those particular comments. That concession gave Booker a powerful opening. If Karl acknowledged that some of his past statements were unacceptable, then how should senators determine which controversial statements represented youthful or rhetorical excess and which reflected enduring political beliefs? The most consequential exchange came when Booker confronted Karl over the Great Replacement theory. Karl defined the concept as the intentional demographic replacement of Europeans in Europe and attributed the formulation to French writer Renaud Camus. When Booker asked whether Karl believed there was currently an active effort to replace Americans, Karl responded that he believed democratic immigration policies had shown signs of such an effort. Booker immediately connected that answer to the demographic question from earlier in the hearing. His argument was that if immigration and demographic change are described as an intentional replacement of one population by another, then the political implication is not merely a debate about immigration policy. It can become a narrative in which one ethnic group is portrayed as losing its country to another. That is where the confrontation moved from a debate over policy into a debate over worldview. Booker essentially argued that Karl's words created an us versus them framework, with white Americans implicitly positioned against Black and Latino Americans. Karl rejected that characterization. And this is one place where the hearing deserves a careful reading rather than simply accepting either side's strongest accusation. Karl did not explicitly say in this exchange that white Americans were superior, nor did he say that a more Latino or Black America would automatically be weaker. His repeated answer was that group composition was not the decisive issue. But Booker's argument was that the problem was not merely what Karl explicitly said, it was the cumulative implication of his previous statements when combined with his current answers. Booker then broadened the confrontation by bringing in Karl's comments concerning the January 6th Capitol attack and his comparison between the treatment of January 6 defendants and people persecuted under Jim Crow. This was a particularly forceful rhetorical move because it placed Karl's views about race alongside his views about political violence and historical injustice. Booker argued that comparing the treatment of January 6 defendants with the terror inflicted on Black Americans during the Jim Crow era trivialized the latter. He invoked the violence against Capitol Police officers and the threat to the constitutional transfer of presidential power to argue that January 6 should not be rhetorically equated with decades of racial terror and lynching. Karl's response was notably narrow. He said he absolutely deplored Jim Crow, but rejected Booker's characterization of his views. That distinction again illustrates the fundamental problem of the hearing. Booker was evaluating the nominee's pattern of rhetoric and its potential consequences, while Karl was repeatedly defending himself against specific interpretations of that rhetoric. The two sides, therefore, were not always answering the same question. Booker was asking, "What does this pattern of statements reveal about your worldview?" Karl was answering, "That is not what I actually believe." Neither approach is irrelevant, but the gap between them is what made the questioning so combustible. Booker's most powerful argument was ultimately institutional rather than personal. Karl was not being considered for an ordinary domestic advisory position. He was being considered to represent the United States in dealings with international organizations and foreign governments. Booker therefore argued that the nominee's credibility would matter abroad. If foreign diplomats, international officials, or governments examined Karl's previous statements and concluded that he viewed demographic change through a racialized lens, the United States could pay a diplomatic price. In that sense, Booker was asking the Senate to consider not merely whether Karl had offensive opinions in the past, but whether those opinions could undermine the credibility of American diplomacy. Karl's strongest defense was that he had explicitly rejected racial superiority, acknowledged mistakes, apologized for Holocaust-related comments, and insisted that he believed in national unity rather than racial hierarchy. His argument was essentially that political opponents were taking controversial statements and constructing a worldview that he did not hold. That defense might have been more persuasive if the controversy had centered on one isolated remark. But the sheer number of disputed statements made the confirmation question considerably harder. Reporting at the time noted that Karl had faced criticism over comments concerning Jews and Israel, race, Juneteenth, and the Great Replacement theory, while also noting that he had attempted to delete thousands of inflammatory social media posts. The final political verdict demonstrated why the hearing mattered. Democrats were already opposed to Karl, but Republican opposition proved decisive. John Curtis's decision to oppose the nomination meant Karl could not count on the unanimous Republican support that was effectively necessary in committee. Karl subsequently withdrew, and the White House formally transmitted the withdrawal to the Senate. In other words, the confrontation did not merely produce a viral exchange. It became part of the chain of events that ended the nomination itself. That is a major distinction when evaluating the significance of this hearing. The deeper lesson is that confirmation hearings are not simply examinations of whether a nominee can recite the administration's policy. They are tests of judgment, credibility, temperament, and whether senators believe the nominee can carry the authority of the United States without creating liabilities greater than the policy benefits they might deliver. Booker clearly believed Karl's past statements demonstrated a dangerous racial worldview. Karl believed Booker was taking statements out of context and refusing to accept his explanations and apologies. Both positions should be examined critically. Senators should not automatically equate controversial rhetoric with a complete ideological identity, but nominees for senior diplomatic positions also cannot reasonably expect senators to ignore a sustained public record simply because the nominee offers a narrower interpretation of it during confirmation. Ultimately, Karl's withdrawal shows that the controversy crossed an important political threshold. It was not only Democrats questioning his fitness. A Republican senator also concluded that Karl's record was disqualifying. The debate now is bigger than Jeremy Karl himself. When a nominee says his past comments were wrong, but senators believe those comments reveal a deeper worldview, should the Senate judge the nominee primarily by his present answers, his historical record, or the combination of both? And where should the line be drawn between legitimate debate over immigration, assimilation, and national unity, and rhetoric that turns demographic change into a racial struggle? Let us know where you stand in the comments, and if you want more detailed breakdowns of the most consequential congressional confrontations, subscribe to Capitol Clips and follow for the next hearing.